Next, I'm going to create the user interface and interface builder and create the associated controller files for the UI elements. I'm going to go to the main storyboard, and at present I have no items on the storyboard. I had deleted the original view controller that I was given when I built this application. So the app that I'm building is going to need a navigation controller as its starting point. So I'm going to drag my navigation controller out, and you'll see that the navigation controller brings with it a view controller, which is a table view controller. And I'm not actually going to use a table view controller. What I'm going to use is a view controller where I add a table view. So I'm going to select this attached table view controller and delete it, and then drag out a view controller. And I want to make this view controller my root view controller for my navigation controller. So I'm going to control click drag from it to the view controller and indicate that I want a relationship segue. I'm going to make it a root view controller. The navigation controller, which is the first UI element that I placed, doesn't have the arrow before it to indicate that it is the starting controller. So I'm going to select it, go to the inspector, and select that it is the initial view controller. So when the app runs, it'll create an instance of the navigation controller. The navigation controller will create an instance of the root view controller, and we need to then proceed from there. So my view controller is going to have a table view in it. So I'm going to search table view, drag it into my view controller. With the table view selected, I'm going to put constraints on all four sides, not constrained to the margins because I want it to go all the way to the left and right sides. And it's going to be below the top layout guide and above the bottom layout guide by 0 points. So I'm going to add these four constraints. I now have the table view inside of the view controller. The table view is going to have one prototype cell. So I just created that prototype cell. And I'm going to give that prototype cell a reuse identifier of, well, let's see, we're working with sports events. So this would be a sport event cell. And the style of the cell is going to be custom because we're going to come back and we're going to do a custom layout with an associated custom class. I'm going to leave that alone for a moment. We're going to come back to the cell. We also have this issue of this additional white space that's appearing at the top of the table view. And the way that we get rid of that is by selecting the view controller and unchecking the adjust scroll view inset. So now we have a table view that goes all the way up to the navigation bar. So when the user selects a sports event from the table view, they're going to be segued to a detail view that displays information about that sports event. So I'm going to create another view controller, drag it out beside the one previous to it, move it over just a little bit. And when the user selects this cell, they are going to segue to this view controller, and so that's going to be a show segue. So this is our navigational scheme. Let me zoom out on this a little bit. We have a navigation controller that has a root view controller with a table view in it. User selects an item from the table view and they're going to navigate to this detail view. The view controller that I created currently doesn't have a custom class, so I need to create one. So I'm going to select the sports event folder, hold the control key down and click on it and say new file. This is going to be an iOS Cocoa Touch class. It's going to be a UI view controller type. So it's going to be a subclass of UI view controller. And this is the view controller where we have the table view listing the sports events. So we're going to call this the sports events view controller. Create that. It gets added to the project. I then can go to this view controller, go to custom class and type sports events view controller. So the code for this view controller is now going to be here. And for the detail view controller, we also don't have a custom class yet. So I'm going to select sports events, hold the control key down and select new file from the pop-up, an iOS Cocoa Touch class, and I'm going to call this sports event detail view controller. Save it. And in the storyboard, I'm going to select this view controller and type sports event detail view controller. Next, on the table view, we need some object to serve as the delegate and data source for the table view. And I'm going to have this view controller, the sports events view controller, serve as the delegate and data source. So I'm going to hold the control key down and go from the table view to the icon represent the view controller, leave up and select data source. Then select the table view again, control click drag to the view controller and select delegate. So this view controller is serving as the delegate and data source for the table view. Now when the user selects one of the sports events in the table view, they're going to want to see the detail of the sports event. And the way that we're supposed to make this look is like the following. So we're going to have the icon for the type of sport, the matchup, and the date. And remember that these icons were 50 points by 50 points. Even though we have 1x, 2x, and 3x versions, the actual layout size is 50 points by 50 points. So we're going to want to do a layout for the information that is contained right there. So I'm going to select that view controller, go to the library and find the image type, and drag an image view in and drop it. And I don't think we have in here any particular requirements on the actual design other than to make them look the way they do here. So I'm going to decide on how I want this to look. So I'm going to notice that this doesn't go all the way to the edge. It goes, it looks like, to the margin. So I'm going to select the UI image view, control click drag out horizontally and say leading space to container margin. So that sets that one side. And then I want it to be below the navigation bar by some amount, looks like maybe 10 points. So I'm going to control click drag vertically, vertical space to top layout guide. And I want this to be 10 points. And then the actual image view, I want it to be the size of the icon that I'm putting in there. And so I want its height and width to be 50 points. So with the image view selected, I'm going to go here and select width and height and set them both to 50. So now we have an image view that is 50 by 50 points, 10 points down from the top layout guide, and I believe 0 points over from the edge. So we hit edit here. We'll see we're 0 points in from the edge of from the margin of the super view. So that is our image. Below the image is going to be the matchup. So I'm going to find a label in the library, drag it out and place it below the image view. And it looks like maybe that is about 15 points below the icon. So I'm going to control click drag up to the image view and say that we have a vertical space. Select this again, double click on that line, and if I can't get it, I can go to the property inspector. Sometimes they're hard to click on. So I'm going to select the label, go here and click edit, and we're going to make it 15 points below the image view. I'm going to also control click drag to the left and do leading space to container margin, and that's set to 0. Now the label knows how far down and how far over to be, and its width is going to be set by the contents in it. But if the content should get longer than the width of the display, that creates some problems. So I'm actually going to establish the maximum width the label can be by control click dragging to the right and say trailing space to container margin and setting that to 0. So the label now is between the margins and the full width of the display. If the contents gets longer than the label, then the label won't attempt to go off the edge of the display. So we now have the label's width set. And then below it, we want to put another label that is going to be when the sports event is happening. So I'm going to drag another label in, control click drag to the label above it, vertical spacing. I'm going to set that vertical spacing to the same as the one above it, which I believe was 15. So the distance of the matchup below the image view is the same as the distance of the date below the matchup. So then on the leading side, we're going to do 0 to the container margin, and then I'm going to control click drag to the right and set a trailing of 0 so that the label goes all of the way across. Now we'll also notice that the matchup is bolded. So if I select that label and go to the Attributes Inspector, we are able to change the label to a bolded font by selecting the font and then the style set to bold. Now the items that I placed in the interface and interface builder need to be connected via IB outlets to variables in the associated controller. So I'm going to select the view controller, open the assistant editor, and we're in the sports event detail view controller. I'm going to create IB outlets to the image and the two labels. So I'm going to select the image, control click drag into the view controller, creating an outlet to a UI image view, and I'm going to say sport icon image view. And then the label is going to be the matchup label, so control click drag, creating that outlet to the label, which will be matchup label. And finally, the date label. So control click drag, a UI label outlet. We will call this date label. So we have IB outlets connecting to each of the UI elements. While we're in this view controller, the data that is going to be used to set the icon, the labels, the matchup, and the date are going to come from a sports event. And that needs to be passed to this view controller in Prepare for Segway in the previous view controller. So I need to create a variable that is going to be called sports event, and it is of type sports event. And it's going to be an optional because initially it's not going to have a value, and then in the Segway we're going to set this value and we're going to be able to use it. So while I'm still here, we're receiving a sports event and we want to use it to fill in the icon, the matchup, and the date. So what can we do? Here in viewDidLoad, this is the function that gets called when the view did load. So this is after we have the data and after the view objects exist, we can use them to display the information contained in the sports event. So let's deal with these one at a time. The first is that we need to display the image in the sports icon image view. So if we say sports icon image view, see if I get that right, sport. So I've made it sport icon image view because it is this icon for the sport. So sport icon image view. The image view contains an image property that we can set, and the image is going to come from the image in the sporting event. So, or sports event. So we can say sports event, and the sports event contains the sport. That's the enumeration. And notice it knew that sports event was an optional so it threw the optional chaining question mark in. So we're only going to proceed to get the sport out of the sports event if the sports event exists. So then we have the sport. The sport is an enumeration, but we created, when we created the enum, a computed property which is the image that is associated with that sport. So I'm going to say .image. So that will get the image associated with the sport from the sports event and set it as the image on the sport icon image view. Next, we need to set up the matchup labels text. So we're going to say matchup label dot text equal, and the actual text is going to come from the sports event. So we're going to say sports event, and just like before, we're going to use optional chaining because sports event is an optional. So if it exists, we're going to then get from it the matchup. If it doesn't exist, then we'll get nil. And that's okay because text here receives a string optional. So if it returns nil, that means the label won't contain anything. And then finally, we need to be able to set the date. Now, currently, the date is a date type, and we're going to need to put that date in a label, which means converting the date into a string. And to do that, we need a date formatter. So I am going to create a date formatter and set it up to convert our date and time and a date to a format that we want displayed. So I need a date formatter. So here in the class, I'm going to say var date formatter equals date formatter. So that constructs one. Then down in the viewDidLoad, I'm going to put date formatter dot, and then I need to set the style on the date. So we have date style, and the style that I want to use is the medium style. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the time style. And if styles are not set, then when we convert the date to a string, that particular piece won't appear. So if there is no time style, I would only get, and I only had a date style, I would only get the date portion of the date. If the time style is set and the date style are both set, then I'm going to get both the date and the time when I convert the date to a string. So that means my date formatter has the style set. Now I can use the date formatter to try to convert to a date string. So sports event is an optional, and I need to get the date out of the sports event successfully before I can use it to get a string from the date formatter. So since it's an optional, it's possible that sports event doesn't exist, that it's nil. So I'm going to use if let to retrieve the date from the optional. So I'm going to say if let date equals sports event question mark dot date. So sports event is an optional. Optional chaining here only gives me the date if sports event can be unwrapped, which means that the date may or may not happen, which means it's going to result in an optional. So if I'm able to unwrap the date that I retrieve from sports event into date, then I'm going to proceed to use it. And if I can't, if this results in a nil, then this if let's never going to happen. So if it doesn't happen, then I need some option for what's going to be contained in the date label. So I'm going to say date label dot text equals nothing. On the other hand, if the date is retrievable, then I'm going to use my date formatter to convert the date to a string. So I'm going to say date label dot text equals, and then date formatter has a method called string from date, and then I'm going to take the date that I got from the sports event and pass it to the from. And so if I'm able to get a date, I am for sure going to be able to get a string from it, and that string is going to be set as the text on the date label. And if I can't get a date, then I'm going to set the text of the date label to the empty string. So when I segue here and have set a sports event, the job of this view controller is to take the information in the sports event and put it in the image view and the two labels. So that takes care of the detail view controller. Let's go back to the storyboard and come back to the table view. Currently, I have a table view with a prototype cell, which has a reuse identifier sports event cell that is a custom type. What I need to do is do my own layout of a cell. I need to do a custom cell. So we're going to do that next. So my sports event cell is in a table view that currently has each of the rows being 44 points tall. And remember that the icon that I'm going to put here on the left edge of the cell is 50 points by 50 points. And I want some white space above and below it. So I don't want the cell to be the same height as the icon. I want it to be taller than the icon. So if my icon's 50 high, I'm going to go with my cells being 60 high. So I'm going to change this number to 60. You'll notice that the cell got bigger. If I go here and select the cell, currently its row height is set to default. This can also have a number, so I could say that the row height is going to be 60 here, and that would make it custom size. So I have my cell, now I need to do my layout in the cell. So I'm going to have an image, and I'm going to have two labels, one label for the matchup and another label for the date. So I'm going to my library, and I'm going to find an image, drag it into the cell. Now you notice it's bigger than the cell, so I'm going to just kind of drag it in there. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to then drag its corners and make it smaller so it kind of all fits in the cell. This is not its eventual size, it's its temporary size. So with the image selected, I'm going to indicate that it's going to be constrained to the margin of the cell, and it's going to be 0 points in from the edge. And so that takes care of that side. I'm going to then also center the image on the cell. I can do that by Control-Click-Drag to the cell, and that will give me center horizontally. I want to actually center it vertically, so I select again, Control-Click-Drag up, and I can now do a center vertically in the container. So this decides how far over and how far up and down, but it doesn't know how big to be yet. So with it selected, I'm going to set the height to be 50, and I'm going to set the width to be 50. Add those two constraints. So now I have this icon being 50 by 50, centered vertically and 0 points over from the edge. So next I'm going to add a label. I'm going to place the label so that it aligns with the top of the image view and is a little distance over from it. I'm going to Control-Click-Drag to the label, from the label to the icon to the image view. Hold the Shift key down, select horizontal spacing, and also have it align with the top. And then so the label goes all the way across, as far over as it can go, over to the margin. I'm going to Control-Click-Drag to the right and say trailing space to container margin. And I'm going to double-click this and set it to 0. So this label, which will be the matchup, can go all the way across. And we'll notice that the matchup is bolded. So I'm going to have the label selected. I'm going to click on the font, and I'm going to set this to bold. So this will display the matchup, and then I want to display the date below it as another label. And I'm going to have this one align with the bottom of the image. So I'm going to drag it there. Control-Click-Drag from the label to the image view. Hold the Shift key down, horizontal spacing, and then also say to the bottom. Add constraints, and I'm going to Control-Click-Drag horizontally and set that so that the label goes all the way across. So this is where the date is going to go. And finally, while I'm here in this cell, I want to have an accessory that is a disclosure indicator. So this is a little caret symbol that we see here in the design that indicates to the user when they tap that they're going to navigate to this detailed view controller. So we have all of the pieces in the cell, and they appear to be laid out properly. Now I need a way to set the items on this cell, which means this cell needs to have a custom class. Just like view controllers had a custom class so we could create ID outlets between the items and the view controller, this cell needs to have a custom class. And then we're going to create ID outlets that connect these items to that class. So I'm going over to my project. I'm going to click on the sports events folder, hold the Control key down, click and say New File. I'm going to iOS Cocoa Touch class, and instead of a subclass of a UI view controller, there's going to be a subclass of a UI table view cell. And this table view cell, the class name I'm going to give it is Sports Event Table View Cell. Hit Next and save this. So back in the storyboard, I want to be able to create IB outlets from the image view and the labels to this custom class. And so first, the cell needs to be given this custom class. So this is going to be Sports Event Table View Cell. So we now have that being the custom class. With the cell selected, I'm going to open the Assistant Editor. I did not automatically get the custom class, so I'm going to go to Manual, Sports Event, and I'm going to select Sports Event Table View Cell. Then I am going to wire up the IB outlets. So I'm going to, here in this inspector, open up the content view, select the image view, and I'm going to control click drag into the custom class for the table view cell. I'm creating an outlet to the image view, and I'm going to call this the icon, let's call it Sport Icon Image View. Then I'm going to select the top label, which is for the matchup, control click drag into here, create an UI label outlet, and this is going to be matchup label. And then finally, we are going to create one for the date label, control click drag, an outlet for date label. So we have now in the custom class for the table view cell the outlets that we can use to then set these three pieces of information. So I'm going to close the assistant editor and take a look at the status of what we have going on here in Interface Builder. So we have our navigation controller that leads to a view controller that has a table view. This table view uses the view controller as its data source and delegate. The table view has a reusable cell, a custom designed cell that has an image and two labels. We created the custom class for it, and we created outlets to those items. And then we have a segue from the cell to the detail view that contains the icon and the two labels, so we can display the information about the item. And this class has the outlets so that we can take the sports event that we receive and use it to set the information in the interface. So let's see, did we set the class on this? So we do have the class on that. So the next step is to write the code in the sports events view controller to load the sports events from the model, which came from that JSON file, and then have it build the table view. Then when the user selects an item in the table view, to have them segue to the detail view. So I am going to the sports events view controller, and remember this is serving as the delegate and data source for the table view, which means it must implement the protocols for that. So we'll have UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. Now, the data is going to come from the model, and the model has this loader that we can call sports event JSON loader that will then load the JSON, call the parser, and return the events. So we're going to use this. So I'm going back to the view controller, and I'm going to say let sports events equal the loader dot load, and we need to give it the file name, which will be sports events without the .json, because when we wrote the loader, the extension was handled separately from the file name. So sports events will be an array of sports event. So this will load and assign this to sports events when this view controller instance gets created. So now we have sports events, we can go through and finish building the support for the table view. So we're going to have number of sections in table view, and this is going to have one section. And then we're going to say table view, and we want the number of rows in section, and this will be sports events dot count. Then we want to have table view, and we need to create the cells. And since I'm not seeing that immediately, I can just type here cell, and it will give us table view cell for row at index path. So we're going to dequeue our reusable cell, cast it as the type of cell that it is, set its properties, and then return it. So the first step is let cell equal table view dot dequeue reusable cell with identifier for index path. The identifier is called sports event cell. Sports event cell. We can see that also here, sports event cell. I'm going to copy it to make sure I get it right. I'm going to come down here and say this is the identifier, so I'm going to give it a string of sports event cell, and the index path is the one that we're passed into the function table view cell for row at index path. So I'm going to put index path here. And this is the cell that we're ultimately going to return. Now when we dequeue a reusable cell, it's going to return a UI table view cell. And our sports event cell is indeed a UI table view cell, but through inheritance. It is in fact a sports event table view cell, which inherits from UI table view cell. So before we can use it to set its properties, that is to use those IB outlets to set the contents of the icon and the two labels, we're going to need to cast this cell that we dequeued as the type it is, and we're going to use as question mark, which means that it results in an optional, so we need to unwrap it. So we're going to say if let cell equals cell as sports event table view cell. What this is saying is if we can take this cell and cast it as a sports event table view cell, which means this succeeds, therefore it results in an optional that can be unwrapped, then we can use that cell as a sports event table view cell and set the icon and the two labels on it. So I'm going to say cell dot, and I'm going to set the sport icon image view. And the image view contains an image, and the image is going to come from the enumeration on the particular sports event. Now, question is, what sports event? Well, this is the cell for row at index path, and the index path contains the row in the section, of which we only have one section. It's going to contain the row. And it's going to be the same row as the row in the array of sports events. So before I finish this line of code, I need to actually get a particular sport event. So I'm going to say sports event equals sports events, which is an array, and I'm going to go to indexPath.row in that array. So that's my sports event. So the icon I want to set is going to come from the sports event dot sport, which is the enumeration, but that enumeration has the computed property image on it, which returns a UI image that's associated with that sport. And so that image is going to be the image that's displayed in the sport icon image view portion of the custom cell. Then next we're going to say cell.matchup label, and the matchup label is a label and it has a text property, and that text is going to be set to the sports event matchup, which is a string. And then finally we want to be able to say cell.date label, and the label has a text property, is going to be set equal to, now I have the problem I had a little while ago. Sports event contains a date type, not a string for the date. So I need to be able to convert the date to a string, and so I need to use a date formatter. And The date formatter I'm going to create once in the class and then use it whenever I need it. So I'm going to say here, let date formatter equal date formatter. And then down in view.load, I'm going to say that the date formatter's date style is going to be set to medium. And the date formatter's time style is also going to be set to medium. So now my date formatter is prepared to be used. So I need to use it to construct a date string that I can assign to the date labels text. Before I do that, I want to get the date from the sport event. And the sports event, well, maybe I can do it directly. Let's give that a try. So I could say date formatter dot, I want string from date, and I need to pass it a date. And the date's going to come from the sports event, so I'm going to put sports event dot date. So the text in the date label is going to be set to a string that the date formatter creates from the date of the sports event. So I've set now all three pieces of information, and we've done everything we need to actually display the items in the cell. The last step here is that I need to be able to convey the information about the sports event to the destination view controller when a segue occurs. So I'm going to write the prepare for segue function, then use the segue that were provided to get the destination view controller, and then tell the destination view controller which sports event was selected in the table view. Segue contains a destination, which is a UI view controller. So we ultimately need this destination, but we don't want it as a UI view controller. We need it for the type that it is. It's a sports event detail view controller that we're going to. So we need to get it and then also cast it as a sports event detail view controller. And as question mark results in an optional, so we need to unwrap it. So we're going to say if let. So this means that we're able to get the destination off the segue as a sports event detail view controller. And that means that the destination has the property on it, sports event. And so we want to give it a particular sports event. The sports events are held in the array of sports events. So we want to get one of these sports events from the array. The particular sports event is going to come from the table view. Let me go to the line above it and let's work this out. So if we say table view, oops, but we don't have access to a table view. When we need access to the table view in order to find out which item was selected. So we don't have access to the table view unless we're in one of the table view functions where it's being called with the table view. But in here in prepare, we don't have access to the table view. So we need an IB outlet to the table view. So I'm going back to the storyboard, selecting the view controller, going to the assistant editor, and we have, this is the sports events table view cell. That's not what we want, so we're going here to automatic. This is sports events view controller, great. So now we need an IB outlet to the table view. So I'm going to control click drag into the class. It's an outlet to the table view, and we're going to say sports events table view. I'm going to copy that so I can use it in the code. I'm going to connect. So now we have an IB outlet to the table view. I'm going to leave the assistant editor and go back to the code we were editing down in prepare. So if we have a sports events table view, in that we have index path for selected row, but that's an optional. So this index path selected row being an optional means that we're dealing with an unwrapping situation. So I'm going to put comma here and say let row equal sports events table view index path for selected row dot row. Index path for selected row is an optional, so we need to put a question mark to use optional chaining. Only if that exists do we call dot row on it. If it does exist and we call dot row, then it's going to be unwrapped into row. If index path for selected row doesn't exist and that's nil, then it's not going to be unwrapped and the if let fails, and we don't call any of this code, which is what we would want to happen if we can't retrieve a row. So we have the destination and we have the row, and so we use the row to go into the sports event array, get that row. That'll result in a sports event, which is what the destination is set to. So we have destination.sportsEvent is the particular sports event from the user selecting a particular row in the table. And again, prepare gets called when a segue occurs. So we use the segue to get the destination, cast it as the type of view controller it is we're going to. We get the row from the table view, which is from the index path for selected row, and then we use the destination and row so that the destination has the sports event. So let's try to run the application. And we see our cells with the icon representing the sport, the matchup, and the date. We select on it and it goes here to a display of the icon, the matchup, and the date. So the final step is for us to commit this. So this is working version of app. Pushing it to the remote. And we are done with our project. Except for one thing. Forgot. Notice that this says event at the top, so we don't say anything here yet. And this says sports event at the top. So let's make those last changes. So I'm going back to Xcode. So in the sports events view controller, this is where our table view is. In the view did load, I am going to say self.title equals, and according to the requirements, we want it to say sports events at the top. And then I'm going to the sports events detail view controller, and in view did load, I'm going to say that the title is going to be event. So let's run it again. It says sports events at the top of my list of sports events, and I select a particular event and it displays the word event at the top. So we are now done, and we can commit the final change. So I'm going to commit and say added titles to top of view controllers in add titles in, I like better, in navigation bar for view controllers. And I'm going to push to the remote. And we're done.